Hello, I'm your host, Sammy Asuncio, and welcome to the Outlook Podcast. I hope you enjoy your stay. On this podcast, I'll be talking about the deeper meaning of books by asking a question and see what we can uncover. Today's book will be concerning William Golding's The Lord of the Flies, as we talk about the philosophy of the boys' actions on the island by asking, why did the boys act the way they did in several scenarios throughout the novel? We will be asking this with a philosophical perspective so that our answers reveal more than what's literally occurring in the book. So on to the question, which is, why did the boys act the way they did in several scenarios throughout the novel? Now, if we were to answer this from a philosophical perspective, there could be many contributors to the subject. One example we can draw from is social conformity. Now, for those who don't know, social conformity is when we act differently to fit within a group. This is also extremely similar to mob or herd mentality. I'm sure we all had similar occurrences before where we were pressured by our peers to do something we wouldn't do otherwise. If you don't believe it, experiments were conducted to prove this being a reality. An experiment conducted by Solomon Asch showed this behavior in action. The experiment had one participant with a room full of actors. The group was asked a question with an obvious answer. However, all the actors answered wrong. But interestingly, the participant, knowing the true answer, followed everyone else and answered the same as the others. This is social conformity in action. After the experiment, the participants said that they did this because they wanted to fit in with the rest, with the fear of being ridiculed. Or they respond that they thought that they were wrong because everyone else was answering differently. So how does this relate to our book? Well, there is a specific occurrence in the book where Ralph and Piggy, two characters who were isolated from the group of boys, joined in dancing with Jack's group. With this knowledge of how social conformity works, we can say this happened because of the effects of social conformity. This inference we just made points that social conformity plays a huge role in how the boys act on the island. Now, similar to social conformity, there is herd or mob mentality. Mob mentality is quite similar, where we change our behavior to fit into a group, so essentially the same thing. However, with a recent interview with Dr. Wendy James, a psychologist, she states that the group behavior, there are three theories: the contagion theory, the convergence theory, and the emergent norm theory. Contagion theory proposes that crowds exert a hypnotic influence on their members that results in irrational and emotionally charged behavior. Convergence theory argues that the behavior in a crowd is caused by like-minded individuals being encouraged to do things because they are in a group. And emergent norm theory that states that when individuals conceal their identities, it can lead to similar crowd behavior. With these examples, we can take situations and see what theory applies. So take the situation when Ralph went hunting and caught up in excitement, started jabbing at Robert with a spear. A quote from the book. Ralph, carried away by sudden, sick excitement, grabbed Eric's spear and jabbed at Robert with it. Now with this quote, we can say that this is mob mentality with the contagion theory. We say this because right after the occurrence in the book, Ralph and the others tried to play it off by saying it was just a game, even though it clearly wasn't. So we can say, after the boys sobered up, they were ashamed of their actions, as if they weren't thinking clearly, just as the contagion theory proposes, that we don't think straight when we're in a group. Now, if we were to take another situation in the book, where all the boys left Ralph to join Jack, we can apply the convergent theory, because they all want to have protection from Jack, opposed to Ralph. So we can say that they're all like-minded individuals joining up, just as the convergent theory proposes. And with the emergent norm theory, we can say when Jack paints his face and, quote, looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but an awesome stranger. This behavior can be applied to the emergent norm theory because he gained some anonymity by painting his face, just as the theory suggests. So we can infer that there are effects from mob mentality from three different theories. Okay, so moving on to our next subject, atavism. Now, for those who don't know what atavism is, the definition is when one reverts to ancestral behavior. Now, while atavism can have a physical definition, such as human tails, we will be using the social side of it. Atavism, affecting the mind, as you will. If we were to search for examples of characters reverting back to ancestral behavior, there are several examples. Take the situation where Ralph and several boys were reenacting a hunt of the pig on Robert. They were blind in excitement. However, after they realized what they were doing, then they tried to pass it off as a game, to hide their guilt. We can infer that this was caused by atavism. The boys dropped all their standards and morals that they were taught while they were still living in a civilization. When they started reenacting the scene, we can say that they dropped all their morals and started acting as savages, as their ancestors probably would, as our ancestors probably weren't very civilized. You may ask, how was this caused? Well, with a recent interview with the psychologist Dr. Wendy James, she talked about how the frontal cortex isn't fully developed until the age of 24. This is important because the frontal cortex is responsible for reasoning and executive control. So with this information, we can say that this can be caused by the lack of their fully developed frontal cortex. So we can infer when the boys act as savages, this can be caused by atavism, affecting them because of the lack of a fully developed frontal cortex. Now we talked a little about morality in discussing atavism, but what does it mean? For those who don't know, morals are the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good or bad behavior. Now, when concerning the boys on their morality, they most likely don't have their morality fully realized. As we previously discussed that their frontal cortex isn't fully developed, but there are more reasons than just that. To the addition of not having a fully developed frontal cortex, the boys on the island have no parental figure, and are left to lead themselves. This is an example of growing up without nurture from a parental figure. It's a fact that the side effects of being raised without parents are quite negative, including doing drugs, being depressed, but most importantly, being more aggressive. We see in Lord of the Flies, the boys acting violently, jabbing at Robert with a spear, or Jack's aggressive behavior towards Ralph. A lot of these actions are often excused with motivators, such as meat being the main motivator for the hunting. So we can infer that the combination of lack of developed frontal cortex and having no nurture from a parental figure can affect the boys' morals. And our last point we're going to touch on is nature versus nurture, which we talked about a bit as well as we discussed about morality. Nature versus nurture is essentially the difference between being born with certain traits and being taught certain traits. We will focus on the nurture side of things. When the boys are on the island, as we mentioned quite often, their frontal cortex isn't fully developed, so that's why it's important that there is a parental figure to help them lead them properly to form a good morality. While it's bad that there isn't a role model on the island, it's worse because of the fact that they're isolated on the island. Since they are isolated on the island, most boys are most likely to do what they must to fit in. An experiment on the subject of isolation shows that 6 to 15 minutes can be too much time to be isolated, and the human brain will crave interaction. So with this information, we know why the boys will join up in a group by conforming to the group, and this is dangerous if the group is violent. This is what's happening in Lord of the Flies, as Jack's group is violent, evidenced by them killing off Simon. Why is this so bad, you may ask? Well, if they conform to a group that is violent, they may nurture themselves to be violent as well, which explains the extreme hostility of Jack's group and why they have murdered Simon without noticing. So, to recap, the boys on the island conform to groups to fit in. However, the boys have underdeveloped frontal cortexes, which leads to having no good morals which can't be corrected properly by nurture from a parental figure. However, the boys are nurturing themselves in a violent and hostile group, which leads to events like Ralph poking Robert with a spear, or the killing of Simon, and more. This is caused by the following: social conformity, mob mentality, atavism, morality, and nurture. Thanks for listening.